Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to have the talk. As a maturing cloud security professional, you're about to learn many wonderful and valuable things that can improve your professional life. But some of those come with a little bit of risk. That's why it's really important for a more experienced security professional to sit down with you and explain the wonderful but sometimes scary world of identity and access management. You see, it's really important to make good decisions around IAM so that it can be a healthy and vibrant part of your cloud security life. All right, enough of the joking here. We're going to start with our discussion around identity and access management. And the reality is that everything we go into throughout all of the rest of Cloud Security Lab a week, we're going to be focusing on IAM probably a little bit in every single lesson. Because the vast majority, if not all of the cloud native security failures that we run into are almost always related to misuse and improper configuration of identity and access management. Now, you hear a lot of phrases like identity is the new perimeter, and people don't always explain why that is and why that matters so much. So I really like to simplify things. We talked about this a little bit before, but if you think about it, the cloud management planes are, all the administrative functions are on the internet. So everything we do, we're doing it through web browsers, we're making API calls, that's all over the internet. And we have full administrative access to a data center, to multiple data centers. There's people with hundreds or thousands of Amazon accounts, and each of those is like a little data center. But as much as that's distributed, all the administrative functions are unified into a single web portal and a bunch of API endpoints. And those are only protected with a username, a password, and maybe some multi-factor authentication. So there's so many details in IAM, and there's just so much to get into. It's an incredibly advanced topic. I don't even know everything. I don't know anybody who does. There's just, it's kind of this endless bounty of potential mistakes to make, but also it really gives us a lot of advantages. And we're going to go through those as we go through all of our training. So we're going to spend tons and tons and tons of time on IAM. Today, I want to start with the basics. And one of the things that I like to do to explain IAM is to start with some of the fundamentals of what IAM is, and then we can actually go ahead and use that to build on in what the differences are between the different cloud providers and talk about all of the different mechanisms and the different primitives. So today we're going to start with just a few simple definitional terms. Then I'm going to show you how those translate into your AWS account. Let me go ahead and pull up the whiteboard for this. Okay, I'm going to apologize now for my handwriting before we get too deep into this. But there's just a few components that I want to talk about with identity and access management. So the first is an entity. And an entity is basically you. So it can be a person, it can be a computer. I'm going to just put CPU to save myself some writing time and to save you some of the pain of looking at my handwriting. So an entity is the thing. And an entity can have an identity. The identity is a representation of an identity, a representation of an entity within a given namespace. So that's the real key here, that an identity is within a namespace. So what's an example of a namespace? Well, in our first lab, when we went ahead and created your root account, you used an email address. That email address is your identity within that namespace. So my regular email is rmogul@securosis.com. Don't worry, internet, that's no big secret. It's pretty much everywhere. That means that I am the user rmogul within the namespace securosis.com, and securosis.com is within the namespace of the internet based on DNS. Well, your root account is, the way to think about that is you used an email directly associated with you as an individual. So in my case, imagine my first account was rmogul@securosis.com. That is my representation within all of AWS. This is why every Amazon account has to have a unique email, because that's how Amazon identifies you as the root account owner across the entire internet. There's other ways to do things, but that's how they do things. Well, that is great, but what if you have to have a user account in hundreds or thousands of accounts, Amazon accounts? Well, that gets very, very messy, which is why we have a different namespace. And the one we're going to use today is we're going to create a new namespace within your AWS account. And this is going to be a user account that exists only within your AWS account. It's not going to work in any other account. Yes, later we'll get into cross-account access and those kinds of things, and that'll make a little bit more sense. But for today, we're going to create a new user that lives only within your AWS account. We're going to show you what that looks like and how you can understand what account you're actually operating within. The next thing we have is your identifiers. And your identifier is how are you actually represented within a namespace? Or how is your identity represented? This can be different things. It can be a cryptographic token of some sort. It can be some kind of unique key or unique value. And we're going to see what that looks like within AWS as we look at Amazon resource names, which are the unique identifier within all of AWS and actually has the path to go down to your individual namespace. So that's kind of the fundamentals of the entities that we're going to go ahead and cover as we go through this. Now, let me check my notes to make sure I get all of the right pieces. Oh, and the other part about that is identifiers are frequently associated with cryptographic tokens. I mentioned that a little bit before. We're going to show you identifiers that you're going to be able to use once we actually get into doing API level activity within AWS. Today, we're just going to focus on the management console. Now, going back over to the whiteboard, we need to talk about some of Amazon's specific their terminology and what I call primitives. So primitives, we're going to be using in a couple of different places within AWS. There's network primitives, there's identity and access management primitives. These are the low-level building blocks that we use to actually build up our structures within AWS. There's a lot of primitives within Amazon IAM, but there's a few that we're just going to focus on today. Now, the first is a user. An Amazon user is an identity that exists within your AWS account. Now, a user is associated with static credentials. This is going to make sense as we kind of dig into everything, but that's a really important distinction is Amazon users are associated with static credentials, a username and a password for console access, and an access key and a secret key if we're going to go ahead and use API access, which is something we're going to use later. Now, the problem with IAM users is they rely on static credentials. And this is one of the biggest sources of breaches in AWS is loss of these credentials. There's a lot of different ways they can be exposed. We're going to go into a bunch of those over time. And once an attacker gets these, they can use them from anywhere on the internet. Again, going back to what I said before, the entire management plane for cloud is internet accessible. And that means that somebody gets these credentials, can use them from pretty much anywhere. There are techniques you can use to minimize that, but they're really advanced, and we're not even close to being able to talk about those yet. So just understand, IAM users are very, very, very risky, and we really want to minimize them. But it's important to have at least one or two in your accounts, as we're going to talk about. Normally, what you might do is set up single sign-on or some kind of federation, which is great, but you're still going to have at least one full administrative user that you can use in emergencies. Now, you might be asking yourself, why don't I just use the root account? Well, you really want to minimize access to the root account as well. The root account is ring 0. If somebody gets the root account, it is game over. They own everything. They can kick you out. You can't get back into your account. But if you have a full administrative user, an IAM user like we're going to build today, that gives you day-to-day full administrative activities in your account. But if that IAM user is compromised, you can always go break glass with your root account, use that to get in, and then you can wipe out the IAM user. So think about it. The IAM user, even with full admin, is at ring 1, but your root account is at ring 0. And then there's these subterranean levels that AWS themselves has. It thus is important to have at least one full administrative IAM user in your accounts. In very large deployments, very large environments, you might handle this a little bit differently. Again, we need to start with the basics. All right, so we talked about our users having static credentials. Users can be part of groups, and we'll see what that looks like today. A group, it's nothing more than a collection of users. Now, the reason groups are helpful is it's just like any other identity management. You can put multiple users in a group, and they will all inherit or can inherit the same sets of permissions. We're going to create an administrative users group today as part of our lab. Then, either users or groups themselves can have a policy. The policy is where the rules live. And there's different kinds of policies in Amazon. We're going to go really in depth in policies. They're conditionals, they're incredibly granular. There's a ton you can do. Today, we're just going to use the really simple policy of star.star. Give me all access to everything in my environment. And then we're going to learn how to scope down from there. So these are the important primitives that we will use today. We're going to have our user, which is a static set of credentials. We're going to use a username and password. We will, once again, set up multi-factor authentication. We're going to put our user into a group, and we're going to attach an administrative access policy to that group, which is going to give us our first administrative user. Once we do this, this is the user you are going to use for all of the other labs. We are almost never going to have to use our root account again. We're going to lock that puppy away. We're going to just stick it in a corner, and that's only there for emergencies. There's a few things we'll have to pull it out for later, but we're not even going to be anywhere near that for a while with these lessons. We're going to create this full admin administrative user. That's what we're going to start using on a day-to-day basis for everything else that we're going to go ahead and do in our accounts. All right, checking my notes here one more time just to make sure we have the key points. So an identity, as a reminder, is a unique representation of an entity within a given namespace. Today, you are the entity. Someday later, the entity might be a virtual machine, an instance running in your environment. But the identity is the unique representation of that entity within a namespace. Identities have identifiers, and the identifiers, we're going to take a look at what those are. So that is the way of representing that identity within that given environment. For our purposes, right now, you know you're one person. You will have two identities. One identity is the root account that you already have. Your next identity is a different representation of you, which is going to be your full administrative user, which is what we're going to use on a day-to-day basis. In Amazon land, your root account is a unique namespace for all of AWS. Now, we're going to be creating an identity within the namespace of only your AWS account. And again, IAM users don't have to be users. In fact, most of the problems we run into, it's not when you create an IAM user and assign it to a person. It's when you create an IAM user and you assign it to something like in your data center, and then that gets compromised and abused by an attacker. The last thing about this is every cloud provider is different. What I've just described, the core principles of identities, identifiers, and entities is consistent everywhere across the spectrum of identity and access management. But the concepts of IAM users and groups and policies is specific to AWS. Azure handles this very differently. Google is a little bit closer, but they still handle this differently as well. So after we're done today, there's only a couple of reasons you'll need to use your root account. One is going to be there's a few Amazon services, a few API calls, like if you want to make changes to some of your billing stuff, where you do need to go ahead and actually use that root account. And then the only other reason is if an attacker goes ahead and is able to compromise your administrative user, you can go back in and you can use your root account to go ahead and re-access your account. There's also a third case, which is, I have run into this for real. Most of you, as you are working in an enterprise environment, you will set up your AWS for single sign-on. That means you're going to have an identity provider and you're going to use federation, and we'll get there for that because it's definitely a little bit more of an advanced topic. The way that that works is you actually put a hook into all of your AWS accounts to refer back to your identity provider, like your Active Directory server, your Ping, your Okta, Jump Cloud, whatever you're going to use. There are cases where organizations, their identity provider has gone down, and then they're not able to get into their Amazon environments, and then that can cause things to break because they can't go in to do maintenance. Actually, one of the biggest examples of this happened over in Azure. Microsoft had a problem with MFA a few years ago with their Microsoft Authenticator multi-factor authentication, and nobody was able to get into their Azure accounts. And I had organizations that I worked with that actually had things starting to break because they couldn't get in and just do regular maintenance. So this is a break glass scenario to have these admin users there for emergency purposes, and if something goes down, even if you're using your single sign-on. Now, there's a couple of prerequisites before we get started in the lab today. So the main things that we're going to need to get started, you're going to have to be ready to log into your AWS account. We're going to log in with your root account, which means the email that we used the last time. You'll need your Authy app or whatever multi-factor authentication app that you used in your first lab. One, so you can log into your root account, but second is we're going to use that and we're going to immediately put multi-factor authentication on our new full administrative user. So that's all we need. All you need is to be able to log into your account. Let's go ahead. Let's get started with the lab. The first thing to do is to go back to the Amazon console. You'll get used to typing this one in, console.aws.amazon.com, and that will bring you to the login page. Once you're on the login page like this, go ahead and enter your root account credentials. So I'm going to flip away while I use mine. Took me a second to remember which account name I use because I have so many of these. You will now be prompted for your multi-factor authentication. I'm going to pull mine up. Okay, back to the console, and your screen should look just like mine right now. The first place we want to go is to IAM, Identity and Access Management. Now, sometimes when you first log into the console, you'll see a few things that you have to click on to say, hey, I'm new to the console. This is how I get around. So I'll give you just a moment to click through those, and we mostly ignore them because I'm going to be teaching you all of that anyway. The console, Amazon's got like 200 something services. It's a ton. If you want to actually see all of the services, you click on this list and you can click on the all services, and it's just this massive list. The easy thing to do is just type into the search box here. So IAM, and click on IAM. This is going to be really basic for some of you who have been using Amazon for a while, but please work with me and let's go ahead and get all this set up so we're all consistent. You'll see here we've got our user groups, zero users, 2 roles. We're going to talk about roles pretty soon. We're not going to go into that today, but those are some default roles that are required for your account that Amazon sets up. Roles aren't probably what you think they are if you're new to AWS, and we're not going to get into those yet. First thing we're going to do is create our user group. So on the left-hand side here, click on User Groups, then click on Create Group. Really simple, administrators, and we don't have any users to add to the group yet. We're not going to worry about that now. And one of the nice things about picking an easy one is right at the top of the list for policies is administrator access. Now, if we look at this, we'll go into how to read these policies later, but you don't need to know how to read JSON to understand that allow all actions on all resources. That's the administrator access policy. We're going to try to not use this a lot. It's really powerful. Misuse of this policy right here has caused massive breaches out there on the internet because people have, attacker gets their hands on this and they can do anything and everything they want. Other than you have to go into the root account to knock them back out. So we're going to pick that administrator access policy, scroll down, create group. And I'm going to be clear, this is one of the labs where the talking was probably going to be longer than the actual hands-on working, but that's okay, 15 to 30 minutes a week. So we have our administrators group. Now we want to create a user. So we're going to go to users, and we're going to go create user. Pick a username that you will be able to use pretty easily. So I'm picking rmogul. It's one that I use pretty much everywhere. And we're going to provide access to the Amazon Management Console. Now, Amazon really doesn't want you to create IAM users. They want you to use their central identity service, but we're not going to get there yet. We're going to create the individual IAM user. So don't click on a user identity and identity center because that's a whole different thing we'll get into later. We want to create an IAM user. We're going to go old school here. For the password, you can use the auto-generated password or enter your own password. I'm going to stick with I'm actually going to use a custom password, and I'm going to flip off my screen so that I can go ahead and use 1Password as my password tool, and I need to tell 1Password to generate a new password for me. Okay, so coming back now, I've got my little bit of setup here, and I'm going to disable create a new password at next sign in. I'm creating a password for myself. I use my password management tool to set this up, so that's what I'm going to go with. All right, then we're going to click next. And I don't want to save it into my browser here because I already have that saved somewhere else. Now we're going to add the user to a group. Later, we're going to do copying permissions. We'll learn to attach policies directly, but right now we're going to keep it simple. Again, as we go through a lot of this stuff, there's going to be all sorts of things you see on these screens that we're not going to want to actually use, and we'll get to in later labs because they're just more advanced capabilities. Checking my details, there's my user. I've got set up for a custom password. I'm in my administrators group. Not going to worry about tags or anything else. Create user. All right, now I can log in as this user. Well, I'd love to black this out, but this is going to be showing up in lots of other areas. It puts my account not at too much risk, but now all of you know my account ID, which shows up on this screen. And let me zoom in a little bit here. The console sign-in URL is something that is really useful and helpful to keep track of. Go ahead and you will want to copy it, or just click that copy button and paste it someplace where you can remember it. Remember, the IAM user we just created only exists within the namespace of your account. And the namespace of your account for now is this 12-digit number. That's your Amazon account ID. Now you get to start seeing how some of this stuff ties together. This is your Amazon account ID, and you are a user, or mogul in my case, within the namespace of only that account. And that's kind of why I went through all of those pieces. So really important. Now, if you lose this, you can log back in as your root user and you can get it, but you definitely want to keep track of this so that you don't have to use it. This is the first part of this. What we're going to do now is log out as our, so I'm going to copy this. I'm going to log out of my root account. Then I'm going to log in as that user, and I'm going to enable MFA, and that's going to be the end of our lab today. So I'm going to go up to the top corner here, sign out. So I've left that page. Now I want to log back in, and there's a couple of things I can do. If I click on IAM user, it wants my account ID. That's that one that was there before. I'm just going to paste that URL, which has my account ID in it, up into the top. Then we go put our username and your password. Now, you didn't see because I cut away, but I actually had two different usernames show up. One was my root account. The other is this R-Mogul user. But again, remember, now I've established my namespace and I've used my identity within that given namespace. So went ahead, put my password in, and sign in. Notice how things look different in the upper corner. Before you saw S.L.A.W, which was just an informal name I set up for my account. Now you see that I'm R-Mogul at. It's just like an email address. It's this user in this given namespace. Look, I might be hammering this a little bit too hard for some of you, but here's the reason why. I have taught thousands of people cloud security. And as we get into some of the more advanced concepts, particularly around connecting between different accounts and such, losing track of the namespace is a really common problem. That's why it becomes really important to understand that core concept and really get it hammered in, because later we're going to learn how to bounce between multiple Amazon accounts as we build out our organization. And sometimes we're going to do that through Identity Center, but sometimes we're going to just do that through this cross-account, using a different cross-account access mechanism. And in all cases, you need to be able to be hyper aware of what your namespace is. Where are you currently operating? Where did you come from? Now, I'm going to click up here and go into security credentials because we want to enable MFA on this user. You notice it flags you right up on top. Before we do that, I want to kind of zoom in on this one piece right here. I talked about one of your identifiers. This is a really important identifier that we're going to get into constantly, particularly when we get into incident response and you start looking at logs and those kinds of things. This is known as an Amazon resource name. And it's very human readable, and it tells you exactly where you are and what you're looking at. In this case, the Amazon resource name is within the namespace of Amazon, within the service of identity and access management. So this part here defines where you are in terms of the service. It could say EC2, it could say SNS, it could say whatever, all the different Amazon services. In this case, we're within IAM is the service. Then, within my account, what kind of resource am I looking at? In this case, the resource is a user. And then what is the identifier for that specific user? So this entire Amazon resource name path is how we can actually track these things down and keep track of them. You notice this other thing, which is this canonical user ID. Well, guess what? This tells me I'm this user in this namespace in this Amazon account. The canonical user ID is your unique identifier across all of AWS. There's like layers of abstraction here that we're dealing with. For the most part, you won't have to deal with, whoops, I zoomed in a little too much there. You won't have to deal with that canonical user ID. But especially as we get into some more of our advanced incident response topics and such, some of those things will start making more sense because we'll have to start tracking things in different ways. We're not going to use this today, but I want you to be aware of it. This, to me, looks like a cryptographic token, which is what we talked about earlier as the identifier. So that's the unique identifier within all of AWS. This is the human readable version. Why both? Well, as you can imagine, what if I delete this RMogul user and then I create a new one with lower permissions? That might create a problem because you could get a name conflict, picking up earlier permissions for that user. So, wow, I only meant to create that user and give them read-only permissions, but because that user previously existed and had full admin, and then they inherit full admin, that would be a really bad situation. Things like your canonical user IDs get around to that because there's always a unique ID. So I could create RMogul, destroy RMogul. Well, please don't. That's me. Create RMogul, destroy RMogul. And every single time I'm going to get a brand new one of these, a truly unique identifier, which is different than the human readable version. Yeah, I know this is where we get into advanced stuff early, but I got to keep some of you advanced people a little more interested in. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and assign MFA. So I'm going to click on Assign MFA. I want you to pull out your Authenticator app and use it just how you used it before. Now, one of the tricks is for the device name, now use the name, the username that you created, and then the environment you're in. Last time, remember, we probably just called it S.L.A.W or something like that. I can't even remember, even though I just recorded that video less than a week ago. In this case, this is just going to help you remember the differences. Not going to make a huge difference. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pause. I'm going to do all of the MFA stuff on my side. Then we'll come in and we'll finish up for the lab. Your screen should look like this now. I have my MFA devices assigned. I have all of my credentials. I have my full admin access with my console sign-in. Remember, you're going to want to copy and paste that, store it someplace safe, not safe, someplace easy to remember so you can get it later. An important thing is even though I have been trying to sometimes I try and mask some of my personal details, Amazon considers account IDs to be public. There are things, if you're really good as an attacker and if you as the defender have left some openings where this can be useful to know and to be able to tie an account to whoever owns that account. But in terms of Amazon's world, this is not considered a secret. It's considered, Amazon assumes that it's public. Now, there's all sorts of other credentials, all sorts of other things that we're going to get into as we go along. But right now, we have username and password access. We have our full administrative user. We are going to start using that instead of our root account. One point before we finish up, which is I remembered as I was setting up my MFA, sometimes your multi-factor authentication might stop working. It can be desynchronized. You can lose your MFA. There's two ways to deal with that. One is there is a resynchronization process. I have MFA on accounts that are like 10 years old that I might not have used. And the resynchronization process is I can open up my MFA, I can type in a couple of codes, and then it does the crypto stuff in the back end to resynchronize my multi-factor authentication device. The other is, what if you lose your MFA device? At that point, you can submit support requests to AWS. If you're the root account, they're going to use what? Your email and your phone number, and maybe some additional information to validate you. We didn't go through some of that additional info and how to set that up on your account. We will do that as a future lab, but I wanted to get a little bit deeper into the weeds on a couple of these things before we jump back and do that. That is why it is so critically important to keep that email address and that phone number secure. There have been cases where organizations have had, and individuals have had accounts taken over by somebody tricking AWS support into resetting MFA, even though that was set up after the attacker had already gotten the username and password. So it's not perfect. They've become better over the years, but that is a problem. And the human factor, we know, the social engineering and phishing is a huge issue across all of the cloud providers. Not just cloud providers, across everything on the internet. And again, that is also why I recommend using those emails, unique emails, with that cryptographic seed in there, because that's really going to make it harder for those attackers. All right. Thanks for your time today. This was a pretty simple one. Hopefully, I gave you some good background on IAM. Hopefully, you didn't just hear my SIRI in the background just kicking off. I'm not going to bother to edit that audio out. This is where we're going to hold off on for IAM for a few more lessons, because the next things I want to jump into are some of our logging and monitoring. This is really similar to how I set up all my accounts when I create new Amazon environments. We start by creating our account. I create my first admin user. I turn on some of my security telemetry, and then we're going to be running from there. Final review. Remember, within identity and access management, an entity, it's you. It's the thing. It's a human. It's a person. It's your cell phone. It's a piece of code. The entity is what we are representing. We represent that with an identity. An identity is a unique representation within a given namespace. And identities have identifiers. We just showed you like the canonical user ID and the human readable versions in AWS. But the identifier is typically something kind of tokens, crypto-ish. That's the truly unique representation within that namespace. Then we went into Amazon. Your root account, your identity, and your identifier, it's your email address, which is unique across all of AWS. Nobody else can use that email address to create an Amazon account. Then within your AWS account, with that 12-number account ID, we created an IAM user. It's still you, the entity on the back end, but it's a different identity because it is within a different namespace. It only exists within the namespace of your account for all intents and purposes. And we gave it the administrative access policy, and this is now what we will use day to day when we log into AWS, and we won't be touching the root account for a while. All right, that's it for today's lab. Hopefully you got something out of it. Look forward to seeing you again.